Hello, I'm Susan Schatz, and this is Ann Kinsella-Meier. Today we will be discussing educational planning for students with cochlear implants. I work here as an Educational Research Associate in the Research and Evaluation Group under the Planning, Development, and Dissemination Unit at the Laurent Clerc National Deaf Education Center, the Clerc Center. I have worked in different educational settings for over 20 years as a classroom teacher, an itinerant teacher, and an administrator. Most recently, I worked with teachers on language planning in both American Sign Language and English, including spoken English. I have worked with students with cochlear implants in general education classrooms, self-contained classrooms in general education settings, as well as in schools for the deaf.
Hi, I'm Ann Kinsella-Meier, a project manager at the Clerc Center. I'm also in the Planning, Development, and Dissemination Unit. I have worked for over 30 years in both general education settings as well as schools for the deaf, as an educational audiologist and as a communication specialist. I have been a co-teacher in a preschool classroom for students with cochlear implants in general education settings. In addition, I served as a cochlear implant consultant at a school for the deaf, designing the supports necessary to incorporate both spoken English and American Sign Language into their educational program.
Some of you may have experience working with students who use cochlear implants, while others may be new to students using this technology. Some of you may be teachers or allied professionals, such as counselors, working in schools, either in general educational settings or in schools for the deaf. Others of you may be professionals working outside of the school setting, in hospital cochlear implant centers, or speech and hearing clinics, and want to support students with cochlear implants in schools. The purpose of this webcast is to encourage you to expand your thinking beyond the technology of the cochlear implant itself, and consider what to include in educational program planning for students using this technology. As you watch today, think about the many possible students you may be serving or supporting. For example, the kindergarten student who obtained a cochlear implant at age 1, the kindergarten student who did not get a cochlear implant until the age of 3, an elementary age student who may be in a general education setting, an elementary age student who is in a school for the deaf, a high school student who is an auditory learner, a high school student who is primarily a visual learner. Yes, each one of these students may have a cochlear implant, but will their plans be the same? No. Today, we are going to address 3 main areas. First, we are going to unpeel the layers of assumptions about students with cochlear implants and look at what the evidence tells us. Second, we are going to look at how this evidence points to the critical importance of systematic planning for the educational supports and services essential for each student with a cochlear implant. And third, we are going to review necessary components to include in the planning process to support students with cochlear implants within any school environment.
We also want to mention that the following areas are beyond the scope of today's webcast. We won't be advocating for or against the use of cochlear implants. We won't be discussing candidacy, surgical issues, or any specific technical aspects of cochlear implantation. Now I will start us on our discussion about what the evidence is telling us. So what does the evidence tell us? Let me first discuss what we mean by evidence. Evidence consists of both observations and research that support or refute a belief or approach. For the purpose of this webcast, when we talk about evidence, we will be referring not only to empirical research, but also to documented professional experiences. As part of discussing professional experiences, we will be reflecting on our own observations working with students with cochlear implants in a variety of school environments. Before moving on, we want to mention that early empirical research tended to focus primarily on speech perception and speech production outcomes. Research is now looking closer at other interconnected factors, which are equally, if not more important, to explore in understanding the comprehensive needs of each student using cochlear implant technology. Today, we will be addressing evidence related to the following three important topics central to students with cochlear implants: language accessibility, social emotional development, and academic and literacy outcomes. We want to make sure you are aware that there is a reference list which accompanies this webcast, and it is arranged to reflect the categories of evidence discussed today. Now Susan will discuss the first topic, language accessibility.
When we discuss language accessibility, we're talking about language being available to a student in the way that they can perceive and process it to learn and interact with and use that language. Accessible language is essential to building language foundations, preventing language deprivation, and avoiding language delay. Evidence demonstrates that when families are actively involved in providing a rich, interactive, and accessible language environment for their child, language outcomes, either signed or spoken, are positively impacted. There is a growing body of evidence regarding what deaf children, including children with cochlear implants, need to be able to fully access language to support their language acquisition and to support their learning. This includes evidence related to the varied listening and spoken language outcomes of each student with a cochlear implant, considerations related to the use of American Sign Language, ASL, and adding sign supports to spoken English. Before moving on, I want to take a minute to explain the difference between American Sign Language and sign supports to spoken English, as this will impact our discussion of language accessibility. When we discuss American Sign Language, ASL, we are referring to a visual language used by members of the North American deaf community. It has its own unique rules of grammar and syntax. For example, the language uses hand shape, orientation, and movement, as well as facial expressions and body movement to convey information. A key point is that ASL is not a universal language. Similar to spoken languages, signed languages develop naturally in their own regions or countries, just as spoken languages do in their own regions or countries. When we use the terms sign or signing, we mean sign supports to spoken English. We are referring to signing to clarify the English language. For example, when we are speaking, we occasionally add signs to support speech comprehension. When we use sign as a support to English, that sign support itself is not a language. Evidence shows that it is important to take language accessibility into consideration at all stages of a student's development, both pre- and post-implantation. For pre-implantation, it is important to consider how a student will best access language when they do not yet have the hearing levels to detect spoken language. For post-implantation, it is important to ensure that a student continues to have access to language while they are just beginning to perceive auditory stimuli. It takes time for recently implanted individuals to develop listening skills. It is also important to monitor how a student best accesses language as they continue in their education. It is critical to ask questions such as, Will the student be able to access language and learning through listening and spoken language? Will the student benefit from being in an educational environment that includes both ASL and spoken English? Will the student benefit from having a sign language interpreter, cued speech transliterator, or a picture exchange system, PECS? It is critical to evaluate, observe, and monitor a student's language abilities to access language both visually and auditorily, to plan for how to develop and use each modality, sign and speech, based on the characteristics of each student at each stage in their development. It is also essential to take into consideration what supports within the educational system are integral to enhancing a student's ability to access spoken language through their implant. For example, what listening and spoken language habilitation supports are needed? Will the use of assistive listening technologies, such as FM systems or other modifications to the acoustic environment, benefit the student? And are there supports in place at the school to ensure proper use of the CI technology related to staff training? In continuing with the theme of accessible language, Mary Ann will now discuss what the evidence tells us about listening and spoken language outcomes of students with cochlear implants.
There continues to be a common misconception that all students with cochlear implants will achieve listening and spoken language outcomes similar to their hearing peers. Evidence, however, shows us that this is not always true, and students with cochlear implants achieve varied outcomes in their ability to understand and use spoken language. There are progressive levels involved in listening and spoken language skill development. Receptively, a student's ability may range from being aware of sound to being able to understand some words and simple phrases, to being able to understand conversations. Expressively, a student's ability may range from being able to say a few understandable words to being able to express themselves with complex words and sentences. How each individual moves through these levels and their ultimate outcomes are unique. It is important to also keep in mind that a student may differ in their ability to understand spoken language as compared to their ability to express themselves through spoken language. Spoken language outcomes are influenced by many factors related to the child, the environment, or the technology itself. All of these factors impact spoken language outcomes. For example, related to the child, some students may also have learning issues, such as language processing issues or other cognitive challenges. Sometimes those learning challenges are known at the time the student received the cochlear implant. Sometimes learning challenges emerge which could not have been predicted at the time of implantation. Related to the environment, evidence demonstrates that when families are actively involved in providing a rich, interactive, and accessible language environment for their child, language outcomes are positively impacted. And then there's the technology itself. Is the cochlear implant properly maintained and functioning, set appropriately, and worn consistently? Susan will now discuss other important areas for consideration, which have been found in the evidence to impact spoken language outcomes.
Spoken language competence is also related to other complicating influences. For example, a student's competence in the pragmatics of language. Pragmatics includes such skills as the ability to understand and use social language when interacting with others, taking turns in conversation, understanding and using social vocabulary, understanding and using idioms and other figurative language, as well as asking questions for clarification. Pragmatic language has been shown to have an important yet often overlooked impact on a student's development as a communicator, whether through ASL or spoken language. Also of relevance, related to linguistic competence in spoken language, is evidence indicating that some students plateau in their language development, or the trajectory of language growth may slow during their later elementary years. Some students may appear on target in their early stages of spoken language development, but later on, gaps may become apparent related to using and understanding complex linguistic structures. It is important to consider having a plan to address teaching these more complex linguistic structures, which may not be incidentally learned. Development of listening and spoken language takes time and involves training. And the learning curve and outcomes for spoken language growth with an implant vary from student to student. While some develop the ability to understand and use spoken language for learning, others may not. Also, some students may develop competence in spoken language for social communication, communicating readily with their friends and family, but they may still demonstrate challenges related to using spoken language for academic learning in the classroom. Again, it is critical not to assume that a student with a cochlear implant will have the spoken language skills to access a general education curriculum taught only through spoken language solely because they have a cochlear implant. Now Mary Ann will discuss what the evidence suggests related to inclusion of American Sign Language, ASL, or the use of sign supports to spoken English for students with cochlear implants. Again, keep in mind that we are still focused on the concept that the language must be accessible for all students.
You may hear the myth that if children learn to sign, they will not learn to talk. The evidence, however, does not support this. There is no evidence to show that the use of either American Sign Language or sign as a support to English impedes spoken language development for children with cochlear implants. In fact, evidence demonstrates that children who have had early exposure to signing, either ASL or sign as a support to English, can transition well to developing spoken language following implantation. However, it is important to keep in mind that for a spoken language to develop in signing environments, evidence also indicates that it is essential that the technology is consistently used and that the appropriate supports are in place to facilitate spoken language development and use. When we look at the use of ASL for children with cochlear implants, it is important to look to research findings examining children with cochlear implants from culturally deaf families. These children were not deprived of language. From birth, they were able to establish a language base in ASL. Therefore, they were able to build upon this foundation to make links to spoken language. These are children who primarily use ASL in the home and demonstrate that they can thrive in their spoken language development when they have the necessary opportunities for exposure to and training with spoken language. Evidence suggests that approaches which promote the acquisition and use of both American Sign Language and spoken English can be beneficial to children with cochlear implants and should be examined more closely. The evidence also suggests that it is important to further investigate practices that include sign as a clarification for English for students with cochlear implants. As Susan mentioned earlier, this is not a language, but can be a system to support understanding of spoken English. While many students with implants who have access to spoken language are being taught using these practices, the research is limited regarding how to effectively implement these approaches as well as how to evaluate these outcomes. And now we are moving on from the discussion on the evidence related to accessible language And on to the next topic of evidence we will be covering, that of social-emotional considerations.
Research is giving greater attention to the social-emotional development of children with cochlear implants. This includes looking at such areas as identity, self-esteem, peer interactions, self-advocacy, and resilience. Evidence indicates the importance of providing a supportive environment, both in and out of the classroom, to nurture the varied social-emotional needs of these children, regardless of their school setting. I would like to share a few of my observations and experiences. When I worked in a general education setting, students with cochlear implants were typically mainstreamed into regular classrooms. I observed, however, that these students tended to socialize during recess and extracurricular activities with their deaf and hard of hearing peers who were enrolled in a self-contained classroom for deaf students in the same school, suggesting that they enjoyed interacting with deaf peers. To me, this exemplified the desire for these students to interact with other students who are deaf or hard of hearing. When I was working with students with cochlear implants in a school for the deaf, I saw how it offered them the opportunity to develop both ASL and spoken English. This provided them the flexibility to communicate with a range of people. I observed how the ability to engage deaf, hard of hearing, and hearing individuals led to positive self-esteem and deaf identity. I would also like to mention something of interest observed at the Model Secondary School for the Deaf, MSSD. There are some students with cochlear implants who have strong spoken language abilities, yet have personally decided to enroll in a school for the deaf after many years in a general education setting. These students have indicated their desire to be educated with other deaf students. They want to feel the connection with peers who have common experiences and be with professionals who get them. This feeling of belonging is important to all adolescents, regardless of hearing ability.
Continuing on this topic of the importance of social-emotional development, I would like to share a few observations from my experiences in general education settings. First, related to identity development. I observed the importance of students having the opportunity to develop peer networks with both deaf and hearing peers. When schools included supports, such as interpreters for after-school activities, guest speakers, those who were successful deaf and hard of hearing adults, and captioned media for school-wide events. Each one of these promoted student engagement, both academically and socially, and demonstrated that the deaf student was a valued part of the school community. Second, related to self-advocacy, I saw how important it was for students to learn to advocate for their own language access needs. It made a big difference to a student's success in general education settings when they had the ability to assess their own communication needs and learn how to request appropriate supports. I had the opportunity to observe some students, even very young students, who had the skills to advocate for themselves when their implant was not working. I also observed students who were placed in auditory learning environments, yet if no one checked, they didn't feel comfortable letting anyone know their implant wasn't working. And they would sit with a non-functioning implant and with limited access to learning. This emphasized to me the need to teach self-advocacy skills to students with cochlear implants, not only in this educational setting, but in all educational settings. More and more research is showing the importance of social-emotional development to academic success. It is critical that this area of development become an integral part of the discussion when looking at the educational planning for students with cochlear implants. Now Susan is going to discuss our third and final area of evidence, academic and literacy outcomes.
As expected, research examining academic and literacy outcomes for students with cochlear implants indicates that language skills are closely tied to literacy, and literacy is closely tied to academic achievement. There are also many other factors noted in the literature as having an impact on academic and literacy outcomes. Some of these factors are working memory, cognitive ability, and executive functioning. It is important to take into consideration that a student's early literacy skills may not be enough to keep them on track academically when they are faced with complex literacy tasks. Although a student may have been functioning on grade level early in their education, the assumption should not be made that they will function on grade level as information becomes more complex and abstract. It is important to keep an eye on these students and purposefully plan and monitor literacy development and its impact on academic learning throughout a student's education. There is much more to consider about literacy and academic outcomes that is beyond the scope of today's webcast. In general, the evidence reinforces how much we still have to learn about determining what factors contribute to successful literacy and academic outcomes for students with cochlear implants. Some of you may have experienced that some students with cochlear implants appear to be doing well in their early education. They may not qualify for an IEP or 504 plan because they appear to be on grade level. Evidence shows that as they get older and matriculate, moving from elementary school to higher grades, these students fall behind academically because they face increasingly more complex language and literacy tasks. It's critical not to overlook these students and monitor their progress continually. We have now completed our review of the evidence revealing what we know about students with cochlear implants. Mary Ann is going to discuss how this evidence points to the critical importance of systematic planning.
So what does all this evidence tell us? It tells us that students with cochlear implants have varied background characteristics. They have variable access to spoken language, resulting in varied spoken language outcomes. They use varied language and communication methodologies. They have varied needs for supporting their social-emotional development. And they have varied academic and literacy outcomes. It also tells us that they must have access to language in a way that they can interact with it to support language acquisition, learning, and social interactions. All of the evidence shared today informs us of the critical need for recognizing that appropriate supports will look different for each student. This evidence clearly highlights the importance of systematic, individualized educational program planning for each student. Without such planning, students with cochlear implants run the risk of having language methodologies, educational placements, and learning supports put in place which may appear to align with having a cochlear implant, but may not necessarily match the student's overall needs. For example, a recommendation may be made for a student to transition to an oral educational setting to facilitate growth in their listening and spoken language skills because they have a cochlear implant. Yet they may not really have the ability at this point to understand and learn through their cochlear implant. Or a decision may be made to discontinue the use of an interpreter just because a student received a cochlear implant, yet the student may not be ready to have this support removed. Whether a student with a cochlear implant is in a general education setting or in a school for the deaf, educational program planning must be central to determining the supports necessary for the student to, first, flourish in their language growth, second, have full access to learning, And third, function as a full member of the school community. Now that I have highlighted how evidence points to the importance of planning, Susan and I are going to discuss the recommended components to include in the planning process.
There are three important aspects of educational program planning. It is important that this planning is collaborative among professionals involved in the student's education and inclusive of family members, based on data, such as observational information, as well as assessments, both formal and informal, and inclusive of ongoing monitoring, as a student's educational needs will change through the years. I will share with you my experience in educational program planning that considers these points. I was actively involved in systematic educational program planning in a school for the deaf. I saw how individualized planning was beneficial in meeting the needs of students with cochlear implants. I saw the benefits of having all of the professionals who work directly with a student come together and, with input from the family, develop what is called a language allocation plan. This language allocation plan documented how and when during the school day each student would have the opportunity to develop and use either ASL or spoken English based on their individual background characteristics and goals. Some of our students were able to use their listening to learn, and we made sure to plan for that. Others were in the process of developing their listening and speech skills, and we planned for that. Still others did not have the auditory skills to access learning through their listening, and we planned for that as well. An important part of our process was monitoring how the plan was meeting the needs of the student and making changes to the plan if needed.
Susan just pointed out the importance of implementing a planning process, which includes collaboration, observation and assessment, individualized planning of language use, and ongoing monitoring. One resource we wanted to share with you, which provides a tool to support all of the components of a comprehensive planning process, is called Students with Cochlear Implants, Guidelines for Educational Program Planning. These guidelines were developed in collaboration between the Deaf and Hard of Hearing program of Boston Children's Hospital and the Laurent Clerc National Deaf Education Center. Over 40 authors with varied backgrounds and professional experiences came together to develop these guidelines. The guidelines were previously titled Children with Cochlear Implants Who Sign, Guidelines for Transitioning to Oral Education or a Mainstream Setting. This original title reflected the earlier thinking that assumed that all students with cochlear implants would transition to a general education setting where only spoken language is used. The revised and expanded guidelines reflect the current evidence that indicates about diverse language and learning characteristics of students who have cochlear implants. This updated tool looks at the comprehensive needs of a student with a cochlear implant, regardless of their educational placement and their language and communication abilities. The guidelines provide a tool to look at the background of a student and guide necessary supports. They include a series of checklists to record observations of a student's receptive, expressive, and pragmatic language abilities, whether they be in American Sign Language, spoken English, or spoken English with sign support. There is also a section for noting if a different language is used in the home or if other supports to communication are utilized, such as cued speech or a picture exchange system. Forms are also provided to summarize educational considerations and recommendations. The guidelines also include a series of appendices which contain detailed considerations and strategies central to effective planning for any student using cochlear implant technology. They are designed for use in combination with the full guidelines or on their own as a resource to support educators and families. These appendices discuss auditory, visual, and education accommodations, strategies to support the use of CI technology, self-advocacy skills, as well as a glossary of terms. They are designed for use in combination with the full guidelines or on their own as a resource to support educators and families.
The following 4 areas, which are included in the guidelines, should be addressed in any planning process for students with cochlear implants. These are language and communication, staffing and staff training, classroom supports for listening technologies, and social-emotional development. Related to each of these areas, it is important to ask questions such as, does the student's current program and supports meet their needs? If not, what modifications can be made? And if modifications can't be made, should an alternate placement be considered? For example, related to language and communication, it is important to think about how the student will be accessing their education. Does the student with a cochlear implant have enough access to learn directly through spoken language from a teacher or allied professional in a general education setting? If not, what supports would be recommended? An interpreter, a cued speech transliterator, or real-time captioning? Related to staffing and staff training, do the teachers and staff in the school have the training necessary to meet the needs of a student with a cochlear implant? If not, how can the school provide the level of staff training needed to effectively serve the student with a cochlear implant? Related to supports for listening technologies, is there a system in place to make sure the CI equipment is functioning on a daily basis? Does the student have access to recommended assistive listening technologies, such as an FM system? And, related to social-emotional development, is there a plan to promote and support opportunities for peer interaction, build positive self-image, and develop self-advocacy skills? If not, what kind of a social-emotional plan would best serve and support the student?
Before we close, I want to share a story about educational program planning and the importance of bringing together the child's educational team. I was working with a young child with a cochlear implant and was part of the team developing his individual family service plan, IFSP. He was receiving services from 2 educational programs, our county's program and the state's School for the Deaf program. In addition, he was being seen for follow-up for his cochlear implant through a local hospital's cochlear implant program. Based on both formal evaluation and observation, this child was not progressing as expected in his language development in either spoken English or ASL. So I was questioning whether his cochlear implant was providing him with access to auditory learning. I also had strong concerns about additional learning challenges. Using the CI guidelines with his educational team, we were able to collectively document his minimal growth in all areas of language and communication. Through this planning process, we were able to bring together not only professionals from both of his educational programs, but also his family members as well as his clinical audiologist. Because we had a tool that brought together the combined expertise and insights of everyone involved, the team was able to cohesively plan for the medical, language, academic, and social-emotional follow-up needed for this student.
In closing, based on the evidence, we know that the wide-ranging characteristics and outcomes of students with cochlear implants are indisputable, We know the importance of accessible language. We know that students have varied listening and spoken language outcomes. We know that students have varied social-emotional needs. And we know that students have varied academic and literacy outcomes. We now know that comprehensive, collaborative, individualized educational program planning, inclusive of all areas of development, must become the standard for each student in any educational setting.
It is essential that this planning take into consideration not only the possibility that this technology can provide access to sound, but all of the factors and evidence we discussed today, which are known to impact outcomes with a cochlear implant. We hope that this webcast expanded your thinking about working with students who have cochlear implants and will be beneficial to your work. Thank you.